Hello, I'm Andrea Goldsmith, and I am recording on a beautiful late autumn day in Melbourne. And I remembered that I had a YouTube channel. I haven't used it for quite some time, and I also have some time to spare. So I decided that I would read to you the first chapter of my new book. And you can see my dog has settled in for the reading. She's a very literary dog and she likes to be read to too. My new novel is called The Buried Life. It was published a couple of months ago and it's doing quite nicely, I think. So here I am with the first chapter. The book opens with two epigrams. The first is from Wisława Szymborska, the wonderful Polish poet who won the Nobel Prize for Literature some years ago. She writes, "Every beginning is only a sequel after all, and the book of events is always open halfway through." And the second epigram is from Stephen Mitchell's version of Gilgamesh. "Humans are born, they live, then they die. This is the order that the gods have decreed. But until the end comes, enjoy your life. Spend it in happiness, not despair." Each of the 15, I think, chapters also is headed up with an epigram. And the first chapter, which is titled Loose Ends, the epigram is from Heraclitus, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name wrongly. And he writes, "Change is the only constant in life." His colleagues called him Dr. Death. Adrian believed no malice was intended. It was a term of familiarity, like any nickname. And it was accurate. Death was his subject. He studied it, he wrote books about it, he lectured on it. As a result of his endeavours, death had yielded up a good many of its stings and mysteries. Dr. Adrian Moore was a professor at one of Australia's top universities. He was well regarded by his colleagues at home and had acquired a solid reputation abroad. His consultancies to government and to the funeral industry had secured his position at the university at a time when others in the humanities were suffering the precariousness of theirs. Coupled with good health and no money worries, he had every reason to be satisfied. But when he awoke on the morning of his 43rd birthday, he acknowledged how weary he was of himself. He looked around his bedroom, more monastic than fashionably minimalist, and noticed the cat bed stowed in the corner, ignored these past 6 months since the death of Thomas. There were cobwebs dangling from the ceiling and insects shriveled on the dusty floor. A sour smell emanated from the bed. It was Saturday, and with no classes to teach nor meetings to attend, his birthday would encroach on the entire day. He'd arranged to have lunch with a cousin and her husband and would probably end up having the evening meal with them as well, either that or a birthday dinner at home alone. His new project had stalled. There was much more to be written about death, but for the moment he might as well be brain dead, an observation wryly ironic at a better time, but painfully abrasive now. Friends and colleagues had suggested he might broaden his field of study. But death was his calling. Death was his passion. However, as he contemplated the day ahead, it was clear he needed to extend his interest in life. Otherwise, the next 50 years, 3 of his 4 grandparents had been nonagenarians, would be truly a life sentence. He'd been in the doldrums ever since Irene dumped him. They were together for 10 years, long enough to assume they'd be together forever. But according to Irene, it was exactly his habit of assuming, rather than inquiring, that had fueled her dissatisfaction, although not, as she made clear, his only fault. She'd left just over a year ago, and it was as if he'd bookmarked life, planning to get back to it once he'd recovered from the breakup. But he had not recovered, and he hadn't moved on. His impoverished social life, oh dear, I hope that worked. His impoverished social life, his packaged meals, the decrepit house, and his own desolate heart all condemned him. He'd experienced bleak periods before. No person committed to a full and dynamic life is immune, and at those times work had saved him. For 12, 14, 16 hours a day, he would rummage through the complexities of death until the life crisis had passed. Death had always been his saviour, an opinion he kept to himself. So many people unfazed by esoteric scholarly topics like hygiene in the time of Homer or nourishment in Norman England were surprised and vaguely suspicious when it came to his specialty, as if death were not a seemly area for study. And I'm just going to check that this is working. I think it is. Okay, I will continue. Adrian had been primed for death at an early age. He was just 4 years old when his mother succumbed to a particularly brutal cancer, and 3 years later, his father too was dead. A chemical engineer who worked in the mining industry, his father, so Adrian would learn, had settled into his wife's armchair one Saturday evening and, wrapped in her smell and his own intolerable misery, had swallowed an antiemetic followed by a cyanide-infused whiskey. Wanting to spare his young son an experience that could scar him for life, he had sent Adrian to the grandparents for the weekend. It was his father's last paternal act. Some people have a plethora of memories of their early life, but Adrian had very few. His 4 grandparents had told him stories about his parents and showed him photos and home movies. But these were memories of their children, not his father nor his mother. He possessed a photo album of his parents before they were married and another of their wedding day, and there was a shoebox of neatly labelled orange Kodak envelopes containing photos of his pregnant mother, the soon-to-be parents, the new parents with their baby. There were many photos of the little family at home, on the beach and in the country, as well as a few loose ones taken by the grandparents of the growing boy alone with his father. But the photos were not proper memories. Adrian knew this even as a child. The mother he remembered was the woman in the wedding photos, in the beach photos, in the photo of the woman hugging her baby boy at a country picnic. Of the real mother, his strongest memory was of her legs, how spindly they were, how they reminded him of the newly planted jacaranda in the front garden that he was forbidden to climb until it was bigger and stronger. The jacaranda grew, but his mother's legs shrank, and her shiny head. He couldn't remember her hair, blondish brown like his own, just her bald head. As for those 3 years between the death of his parents, he remembered how he would slip his own child-sized feet into his father's large leather slippers and flip-flop around the house. He remembered the mixed nuts his father had with his evening whiskey and the cubby he and his father had built in the Monterey cypress at the back of the house. Trivial memories and an irritation if he were at all troubled by the early deaths of his parents, which he was not. With both parents gone, he had headed into a future with the old couples, 1 week with the maternal grandparents, the next with the paternal ones, a pattern that lasted until he finished school. Both mother and father slipped first into memory, then into family stories and photographs, and ultimately into myth. Children like to belong, and Adrian was no exception, but he was saddled with differences. In addition to the absent parents, there was the girly dimple in his right cheek, and the fact he lived in 2 different houses with 2 sets of grandparents. One other child at his primary school, also a boy, lived with his grandparents, and everyone knew it was because he had no father and his mother was a drug addict. People were nice to the drug addict's son because they felt sorry for him. Adrian hated being different, but he knew the 4 old people loved him with a boundless love. They loved him, and they spoiled him, and they rarely reprimanded him. And because he loved them back, it was better he felt bad than they did, so he suffered his difference in silence. His grandparents had seemed so old when he was a child, but they were only in their early 60s when his father died, and all but one lived long, healthy lives. long enough to have known Irene and hoped to have become great-grandparents. It was, however, the one who died early, Grandpa Bert, who had a lasting impact on his own life choices. Adrian couldn't remember if he'd attended his father's funeral. It was Grandpa Bert's funeral, just 3 years after his father died, that he identified as his first. And this memory was very clear. The coffin was huge and toffee-coloured, with enormous brass handles, a box much bigger than his short, thin grandfather. And it was incongruously shiny for this grandpa, who was always a bit scruffy and smelled like an old cupboard. Throughout the service, Adrian did not remove his gaze from the coffin. Grandpa Bert was lying inside. Was he dressed or naked? Did he still have his dusty smell? Was he really dead or just sleeping deeply like in fairy tales? Adrian was sure the doctors would know the difference, but still the question nagged. And afterwards, was there an afterwards for his grandfather, or was it all finished for him? Nothingness, forever. And what actually was nothing? Adrian tried to experience nothingness, but every time some thought or other would cut into the blankness. And his blotchy, bedraggled grandmother, she said she hadn't been crying, but her bleary eyes betrayed her, and she looked like she hadn't slept for months. Why did death cause such sadness, and why were memories and pictures of the dead person so useless when it came to this death sadness? And why did people lower their voices when talking about death? And what was the mystery here, and the fear? Why was death so hard? Does an experience common to all humankind, indeed to all living things, should retain so much mystery and engender so much fear, still fascinated him? He'd written on several aspects of death, but his primary interest, and the area on which his reputation rested, was the social and cultural meanings of death in the modern era, the ways in which attitudes and practices about death expose the fundamental principles, values, and beliefs of a people and their culture. And he was still interested in death, he decided on the morning of his 43rd birthday, but the energy was lacking, and had been since Irene walked out. He'd thought she'd return, although he now realised the signs were clear from the outset that a decision was final. Within a couple of days of her leaving, she'd wrapped her keys in a "thanks for the memories and it's better this way" note, adding in a postscript the arrangements she'd made for the removal of her furniture and other belongings, sealed the key and note in an express envelope and posted it to him. He had phoned and left voice messages. He texted and emailed. He connected through Twitter. He even revived his moribund Facebook account, but despite all his efforts, Irene did not respond. And then she blocked him. He thought he'd see her at the places they'd shared, the organic grocer, the cinema, the bookstore. He thought they'd meet through mutual friends. But this woman, central to his existence for 10 years, had quit their life entirely. With little choice in the matter, Adrian had settled into his single state. But if this morning of his 43rd birthday were any guide, he was drifting with the current of the days. He woke at 7 a.m, he went to work, he taught his classes, he marked papers, he attended meetings, he came home, he fiddled with his new book, he read, he slept, and he spent an inordinate amount of time online. As of the previous day, he subscribed to 41 Twitter feeds and 7 news sites. He checked out several dating apps, browsing as much as he could without signing up. If he'd been a shopper, he'd be bankrupt by now. Life, a fully lived life, was mouldering away while he was fast becoming a dry husk, like Casaubon in Irene's favourite novel Middlemarch, a man who, by his own admission, said, "I live too much with the dead." Schopenhauer, saturnine sage and a regular companion since Irene's departure, warned that one has to take a somewhat bold and dangerous line with his existence, especially as, whatever happens, we are bound to lose it. George Eliot and Schopenhauer, along with plain common sense, were telling him that unless he was planning to be a 43-year-old slacker or suicide, he needed to take some radical action. He stripped his bed, tossed the sheets into the washing machine and set it going. He decobwebbed, he dusted, he swept and vacuumed. He put Thomas's bed out on the footpath for someone else's cat. He showered and dressed and left the house. Thomas's bed had already disappeared. The oaks were a brilliant red, the elms a bright yellow, the air was crisp, the sun gentle. He'd forgotten how much he liked autumn, had forgotten quite a lot this past miserable year. Irene blamed all his faults on the early deaths of his parents, exacerbated by his strenuous denial of the significance of these losses, but she was wrong. He subscribed to the famous Jesuit maxim, "Give me the child until the age of 7 and I'll show you the man." His mother died when he was 4, his father died when he was 7, so he's well and truly formed by the time both parents were gone. And while it was true his grandparents had loved him unconditionally, he wasn't passive. He'd made something of his life and he'd done his fair share of the work with Irene. So perhaps the failure of their relationship wasn't entirely his fault. Yet he was the one unhappily alone at 43. Irene, so he'd heard, had moved on. He skirted around an enormous pile of hard rubbish outside a block of flats. Someone had done a massive clean-out. There were chairs with ragged rattan seats, a stained and flabby single-bed mattress, a bank of drawers dotted with stickers, 2 rusty woks, a stack of tarnished saucepans, an ancient camping stove, an open carton of electrical goods, and a good deal more. He was about to move on when he noticed a picture shoved in at the back of the jumble. It was a wedding photograph, the size of a colossal TV screen. The picture was sealed under glass and held within an elaborately carved dusky gold frame. He shoved some of the junk aside and stepped in closer. The photo, taken late in the day, depicted an outdoor scene. The sky glowed a pinkish orange, the shadows on the grass were long. There was a swathe of shaved lawn in the foreground where the wedding party was positioned, and at the rear of the picture was a wide double-storey Victorian terrace. On the upper story of the terrace and filling the balcony were the wedding guests, all dressed in formal attire. The photo was so large he could see the facial expressions on the guests, all of them smiling at the newlyweds who were embracing on the lawn. 4 bridesmaids dressed in identical maroon gowns stood in a row on the bride's side, and on the other were 4 groomsmen in tuxedos, ruffled shirts, and maroon bow ties. Adrian was no follower of fashion, but the clothes looked like the formal wear of 30 or more years ago. This lavish wedding photo must have hung on a wall for years, not in one of the flats of this modest block, but in the home the couple had shared, the home in which they'd lived and loved and raised children and come to hate each other. He assumed that the wife or husband now lived alone here, though on further thought he was sure it was the wife. A man would have broken the glass, ripped out the photo, torn it up and made a bonfire of it. There was a controlled, fuck you feminine attitude in leaving it whole and perfect on a rubbish dump. Everyone in the picture looked happy. The young newlyweds were glowing with love for each other. A glorious future stretched before them. What could possibly go wrong? It's quite a statement, isn't it? He jumped back, missing the dog, but not the dog owner's foot. It was Kezzy out walking Lottie. Kezzy was smiling and clearly not hurt. Adrian gave her a proper hug and not the perfunctory clasp and release that he knew she hated. Keziah Ferguson had a fine nose for fakery. The 2 of them stood close together, gazing at the picture. Yes, he said, it is quite a statement. And an unambiguous one. Kezzy's face, pale and childlike, wore an ironic expression. Adrian moved closer and linked his arm with hers, felt her lean against him. She was short and round, with a perfectly proportioned teddy bear figure. She said she was fat, said it derogatively, but he loved her exactly as she was. And a conservative dresser himself, he admired her style. Today she wore jeans and a flowing emerald green shirt, her bleached white buzz cut sporting matching green stripes. A jumper draped across her shoulders had slipped, and he straightened it, revealing the eucalyptus branch with two bright parrots twined around her upper arm. Most tattoos were banal and unattractive, but he liked this one. She joked that if she ever lost weight, the parrots would slip off their perch. Lottie had plonked herself down on the pavement, not really sitting nor lying, but reclining against a bank of drawers. Lottie, short for Charlotte, was a very old dog. "Photos can lie," Adrian said, nodding at the picture. "Perhaps behind the smiles they are already in trouble." Kezzy shook her head. "Look at the fashions. The wedding took place decades ago. It's an angry act, Adrian. The marriage became garbage. The husband probably found someone younger." Kezzy had little to say that was positive about either marriage or men. Adrian was about to suggest that the act revealed strength rather than anger, but Kezzy had moved on. "Happy birthday to you," she sang in a sweet, tuneful voice. "Happy birthday to you. You thought I'd forgotten. Happy birthday to you." She asked about his plans for the day, and when she discovered his evening was free, invited him to dinner. "My place, 7:30. She gave him a peck on his cheek, nice cologne by the way, and crossed the street to her house, the old dog trailing behind her. Kezzy lived in a terrace cottage, the middle dwelling in a row of 5. Each had a small garden in front. Adrian noticed how pretty and well maintained her tiny patch was, such a contrast not only with the other cottages, but also with his own dry and dingy plot. She rented her place, he owned his, yet she was the more house-proud. And while he was quick to blame his domestic neglect on Irene, it was a fact that Kezzy, despite her youth, had suffered many more losses than he had. "Wait a moment," he shouted and ran across the road. "Can I borrow your gardening tools?" She looked surprised. "I'm spring cleaning my life," and followed her inside. Adrian waited in the living room while she collected the tools. He was entirely at home here. He regularly ate dinner seated at Kezzy's kitchen bench. He helped her with heavy chores, and often they would while away an hour chatting over coffee or a drink. Kezzy was his closest friend in the neighbourhood, despite differences of age, gender, work, religious background and sexuality, although both shared a preference for girls. He wandered over to the table. Uncharacteristically for Kezzy, there was a mess scattered across the surface. He could see letters, cards, a bundle of photos, ribbons and other tat. On the floor was an empty cardboard carton. When she returned with the tools, he asked, with a nod to the jumble on the table, what she'd been doing. There was a dismissive sniff. "That's my childhood," she said. "I'm trying to decide what to do with it." And with a sweep of her arm, she slid the lot off the table into the carton. The objects from his childhood would fit a similar-sized box, Adrian was thinking, yet for most people, the things they carry from the past take up a good deal more space. Even his good friend Mahindra, despite having moved countries, could point to the carved side table that had belonged to his grandmother, a set of bowls from his mother, an assortment of serving dishes he remembered using as a child, lengths of material, embroidered cushions and framed pictures of ancestors. Mahindra missed India, he missed his extended family, but every day in his Australian home he was reminded of his Indian past. So different for him and for Kezzy too. "We're fellow travellers," Adrian said with a smile. It was clear she was unfamiliar with the term, and why should she know it? She was 28 years old and had never known a time when European communism was a player in world politics. He quickly explained the reference, then asked why she needed to do anything with her old stuff. She sighed. Perhaps it's an attempt to take control of the past. She handed in the bag of her gardening tools. A futile attempt, I expect. William Faulkner wrote, was Adrian who was speaking, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Well, this Faulkner guy may be right, Kezzy said, but I'm hoping it's possible to reshape it, strip the past of its power. Adrian slung the bag over his shoulder, stepped forward and embraced her. She was not much older than his graduate students, but he wasn't allowed to make friends with them, and there was certainly no hugging them. Kezzy was the only young person of significance in his life. She was funny and warm and determined, with a certain maskless quality, not guilelessness nor innocence, but a reliable authenticity, and perceptive when it came to other people. As for her problematic past, she'd been raised in a weird Pentecostal community on the outskirts of Melbourne. Often she would regale him with tales from the God face, always with humour, and, he noticed very early in their relationship, an undertow of sadness. It was the sadness that dominated now. She lingered in his arms, then pulled away. She didn't like to appear weak. "I need to get to work," she said. "I'll see you later for dinner." And that's page 14 and the end of the first chapter. And depending on how this is received, I might record the second chapter. But that's all for now. Goodbye from me and from my dog. Thanks for listening. Bye.